Hello, class. This week we start with a story about a golden apple, a very famous story. It starts with Zeus, who presides over a banquet wedding. The wedding is for Peleus and Thetis. And Zeus fails to invite an important goddess, Eris, the goddess of discord, who comes to the banquet anyway and disrupts. She disrupts the banquet by presenting a special object, a golden apple from the famous Garden of Hesperides. It has an inscription written on it, which states for the fairest one of all. She throws the apple into the center of the room, and then she leaves. This sets into motion quite a few different things, including, like I said, one of the most famous stories that we're going to get to later on. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite want to lay claim to the apple as well as the inscription on the apple. And they demand that Zeus judge who is the most beautiful of all. He passes that judgment on to Paris. I think that's probably a pretty wise choice to deflect from his having to decide between the three. So Paris, who's a mortal prince of Troy, is really having a hard time deciding which goddess he would choose. They all offer him different kinds of gifts, like wisdom or strategic information for winning battles. But Aphrodite offers him a little bit of a different thing. And not a thing, a person. She offers Paris Helen of Sparta. Paris famously decides that he would prefer this gift above all others. And so he deems Aphrodite to be the fairest of them all. And she wins. The story becomes what is famously told as the judgment of Paris. That's a story that we're going to have to come back to later. We're going to spend some time on that. But it does help us to imagine an introduction for this week of the goddesses of Olympus. Specifically, I'd like to dive into each one of them, how they were described by the most famous of the writers and the oral traditionalists. But I'd also like us to take a look at some of the other stories that surround them, as well as some of the other writings that place them in a different role, in a little bit of a different light. I'd like us to get back around to the story of the golden apple at the end of this next week and the week after, and talk a little bit about that story and how we read the story after reading a little bit about all of these different goddesses. And I'd also like us to focus on the feminine in Greek mythos. And that's a difficult task to kind of undertake because, again, just like dealing with the stories of Zeus, the story of Hades, the story of Poseidon, these different goddesses have thousands of years of stories and tellings and retellings and appropriations of who they are as goddesses, as figures that people have worshipped. And so this week, what I'd like you to do is get some groundwork, just reading from the Theoi and a few other places about who these goddesses were, what their major stories are, and what the major stories are connected to them, as well as dive into a little bit of literature from essays that I found that are critical essays that ground the stories of the feminine goddesses in a little bit more of a contemporary telling. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we take away from it look at them in the contemporary lens. Rather, I'd like us to start to think about the people that, or the women and men who are telling stories of these goddesses that didn't win out, in that those stories were just completely told and retold. Some stories that, and some ways of thinking about them that may have been ways that ancient Greeks thought about them. And the problems that we see with the telling of a lot of these myths. Just like we are gathering information from all of the Greek myths, like the Titanomachy and all of those stories that came before, that we have some issues with currently, because the differences between our thinking and the thinking of people that came before might be dramatically different. They also might be very similar. So I want us to just get informed of some of the stories that are passed on that are pretty famous and pretty well known, but I'd also like us to angle our lens and talk a little bit about the feminine in the Greek mythos. So that's what I have for you this week. And I want to get back to, in a lecture next week, a lecture about that golden apple and the depictions of the Greek goddesses and the way that we see them. All right, so happy reading this week, and I'd love to know what you think about these stories and what you think about the essays that I'm going to attach. There is some supplemental reading. You don't have to do all of the supplemental reading. There's going to be an essay that I'd like you to dive into. It's a little bit longer, but I think it gives a really good indication of some current thinking and some semi-current thinking on the changing and kind of interesting way that these stories kind of manifest themselves in different cultural histories that we see. Okay, all right, I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.